Welcome to Future², the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future² brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick, digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future² is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast.
Welcome to Collective Campus for our first episode of Future² Live. Can I maybe get a show of hands who actually listens to the podcast? Got a few in the audience. We've actually got about 1,800 listeners a day at the moment, so we're climbing the ranks on iTunes, bouncing anywhere between top 20 to top 50 since launching 6 months ago. So it's been a pretty fun journey so far. Interviewed guys like Steve Blank, Jake Knapp from Google Ventures. We've got Alex Osterwalder on there soon. Interviewed Pascal Finette from Singularity University the other day, David Allen, and it's a pleasure to have Ash Maurya here today as well. So if we're going to have a first live show and a first live guest, what better guest to have? So without further ado, as I like to say on the podcast, hailing from Austin, Texas, Ash Maurya is the founder of Leanstack. Since bootstrapping his last company 7 years ago, he has launched 5 products and 1 peer-to-web application framework. Throughout his time, he's been in search of better, faster ways for building successful products. Ash has more recently been rigorously applying customer development and lean startup techniques to his products, frequently writing about this on his blog, ashmaurya.com, and turning this into the critically acclaimed book, Running Lean, How to Iterate from Plan A to a Plan That Works. Ash is also the creator of the one-page business modeling tool that I happen to absolutely love, the Lean Canvas, which is used by startups and corporate innovators across the globe. His new book, Scaling Lean, Master the Key Metrics for Startup Growth, debuted at number 2 on the Wall Street Journal Business Bestseller list. And it basically explores an invaluable blueprint for modeling startup success and ultimately scale a business by implementing a 10x rollout strategy. Ash is also a leading business blogger, and his posts and advice have been featured in Inc. magazine, Forbes, and Fortune magazine. He regularly hosts sold-out workshops. He hosted a 2-day workshop. Well, he's in the middle of a 2-day workshop in Melbourne. Today is the conclusion of day 1, so I hope he's not too tired for us tonight. And we had about 30 people in here today, so another sold-out workshop. And he's also mentored to several accelerators, including Techstars, Mars, Capital Factory, and guest lectures at several universities, including MIT, Harvard, and UT Austin. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to bring to you Ash Maurya.
Pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Ash. So you've been bouncing back and forth. I understand you were in Sydney a few weeks ago. You like to do things a week at a time, I understand?
Yes. So I have this working constraint that I put upon myself. Mm-hmm. So I from the start did not want to be on the road all the time, but knew I had to travel some. So I made a plan where I would travel once a month, a week at a time. But the world was my oyster, so I could go anywhere, but for a week at a time. And so the first thing I did is I got it wife and family approved. So wife and kids signed up on that, always important. But it really, for me, is the right balance because I do a lot of maker stuff. As you know, I write, I create content, and it's very hard to do that when you're on the road. You just get all distracted. So it's a way for me to go out and be an extrovert for a week, and then I go back and to my introvert self for the next 3 weeks.
Okay, fantastic. And we've got a few Texans in the crowd tonight, I believe, from Houston and a few other places. How are you guys adjusting? Well, how are you adjusting to the weather here, coming from 110 degrees Fahrenheit?
It's not quite that bad, but I think it's always better weather is good, but I'll take anything. So when I did land in here, the sun was shining on the Monday, so brought some of the sun with me.
Brought some of it, fantastic.
Didn't really last too long.
So Ash, your first book, Running Lean, was all about helping startups adopt a lean development methodology to help them fail fast, run experiments, and increase their likelihood of success. For those in the audience who aren't familiar with your product, can you perhaps give them the 30-second elevator pitch?
For Running Lean?
For Running Lean.
Yeah, so the big epiphany, so I'm a product guy. I build, I knew how to build products very well. And one of the big epiphanies in Running Lean was realizing that when we go into product development, we think of our solution as being the most important thing, but it's really the business model. So that was the core message to get out. And then the rest of the book talked about how you can model your business model using this tool called the Lean Canvas. How do you get outside the building and talk to customers and figure out what they want without asking them directly? Because to quote Steve Jobs, customers don't really know what they want. So there are a lot of these techniques for doing problem interviews, solution interviews, and extracting what customers really want and need, and then building those things using a lot of the lean techniques.
Fantastic. And given that you run so many workshops across the globe, would you say that's kind of an epiphany for the majority of people that attend your workshops?
Yeah, I was surprised by that. I thought I was just me doing things the wrong way all these years, falling in love with my solution, not the problem or the business model. Yeah. But as I began to share this, I got tons of people nodding their heads and saying, we've been there, we did the exact same thing. And that's when all the pattern matching happened. I began to see that entrepreneurs are everywhere, all across the globe. We may speak different languages, but we all want the same things, fear the same things, and tend to make the same types of mistakes. And so that was what also inspired me to do more of these crazy 1-week trips and just go to more places.
Fantastic. And essentially, we're having a chat earlier. You're talking about how Startup is essentially a mission-driven organization. That's why, doing a lot of this stuff, helping spread the message so not as many individuals and companies go out and just blow a lot of money on this first grand idea that they had.
Yes. Yeah. So that was kind of that big spark, is seeing that there is entrepreneurship. And if I were to say what that impact is, what I'm driven by is really helping create more entrepreneurs, but better entrepreneurs in the next 10 years. And ideally not have everyone just decide they want to move to Silicon Valley. So that's not, to me, the right solution. It's rather creating not your own Silicon Valleys, but your own versions of the ecosystem that works in local communities, and keep the knowledge there and keep the communities there, and kind of innovate in your own way.
And I think that's a great point. I think a lot of cities around the world are trying to just copy what Silicon Valley does, but you can't really mimic the entire environment. So your second book, as I mentioned, it's debuted at number 2 on the Wall Street Journal Business Bestsellers list. It picks up where Running Lean left off. So what can readers expect to learn from Scaling Lean that they wouldn't learn in Running Lean?
Sure. So both books are very entrepreneur-centric. So they're focused on the entrepreneur as being the protagonist in both stories. And the first book, Running Lean, was really about the entrepreneur to customer conversation. So how do you get outside the building and understand, as I said, what customers want without just going out and directly asking them? So there are all those techniques for doing it. What I found is that since the first book, tons of people were inspired to go out and they got all this learning. They came back to their stakeholders and said, look at all the stuff we have learned. Look at these minimum viable products we have built. Look at the small customer bases we've got for validation. But the stakeholders said that I don't get it. It's still too small. I don't see the big rainbow at the end. So we're used to measuring, especially in corporates, we're used to measuring success by old metrics. So we want to see revenue, and we use the same metrics which don't apply in early stage stuff. Yes. So the second book is all about the conversation between that innovator, that entrepreneur, and their stakeholders. So how do you come back and not talk about traditional metrics, but rather innovation metrics, and how do you use leading indicators and kind of communicate all that? So that's what the second book primarily is about.
So I guess you're alluding to their metrics like internal rate of return, net present value, and if that's what you're hanging your hat on, chances are in 99% of cases you won't see those metrics in the first 2, 3, 4 years maybe.
Even worse, they're going to be negative, growth, on the red, and you're not going to see them, and so that creates a lot of concern. And so how do you put the right metrics in place of that? So that's absolutely the point.
I can see how that would support conversations in large organizations between product development and say, finance. What kind of metrics would people be looking at instead of those traditional metrics?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Dave McClure's Pirate metrics.
Yeah.
So that's the 5 metrics there being acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, referral. I find that a lot of people look at it from a marketing lens and look at it as a marketing funnel. But in the book, I start to look at it more from as a kind of a different representation. So it's more of a system view to how you might look at those metrics and how they interrelate. So it's those basic 5 metrics, but the way that you kind of visualize it, the way that you use them it's a different presentation. And I think it has had a very different impact when we have gone to both startups and corporates and showed that way of using the metrics.
Yeah. So I guess for our audience, in terms of the practical application of those metrics, would that be acquisition as in getting a click through to your website, activation as in a sign up on your website, or?
Yeah, those would be a good comparable. So if you had an online product, acquisition would essentially be measuring the point from where you've got a visitor to your site to where they become interested. So it's really them spending time or them identifying themselves as I'm interested in your product. Activation would be the first experience. So this would be where you test your initial value proposition. Ideally, you deliver as much of it as possible and get people to say, this is where I want to be. And if you can activate people, they come back and are retained, so they use your product more. And that's when you can begin to monetize. So I look at a business model as doing 3 things. You have to be able to create value. You have to be able to deliver value and then capture some of that value back. So so we use the activation step to create, deliver value, and then the capturing of the value is the revenue. And if you create enough happy customers, they then refer your product. So that would be the feedback loop from your customers.
Makes perfect sense. And on corporate metrics and approaches to innovation, I know you've been doing a bit of work coaching corporates in this space. So I'm sure there's quite a few people here and those who will listen online who work for large organizations, and getting their organizations to adopt something like Lean Canvas, for starters, can be a challenge. So keen to hear how you've managed to influence people in organizations to actually see things a bit differently.
Yeah, in some ways, I've been pleasantly surprised. They have actually influenced themselves. So,
makes your job easier.
It makes my job easier. So I'm surprised, and when I say I'm surprised, is that we actually have an online app, and so we know everyone who's using that app. But I go into big organizations, and I find that they're using the Lean Canvas off the radar. So we don't even know they're using it because they are concerned about privacy, security, and so they just create a version of that. But when we've gone and talked to them, the thing that I find, one of the reasons that I think the Lean Canvas has been adopted is it's really a business modeling tool disguised as a maker tool. And it's very reflective because I was an entrepreneur. When I looked at the original business model Canvas, which some of you might have been exposed to, it was a very kind of strategic view on the business model. And I felt that there were many things that were too business oriented, and they were too ladder stage, like scaling. And so for me, it was trying to create something that was more approachable. So the fundamental thing is, who are you trying to serve? So who are your customers? What problems do they have? And what solution do you put to solve those problems? Yeah. And just that is the foundation of the Lean Canvas, and everything else kind of builds on top of that. So I think because of that, you find a lot of makers, a lot of product owners kind of adopting the Lean Canvas and using it as a tool, even just for release planning, but it becomes adopted that way.
Yeah, and that essentially then addresses what you call out in your book, the 3 main risks: customer, product, and market risk, by focusing on problem solution as opposed to all that latter stage business model stuff.
Yes, that's right.
Fantastic. And on corporates, there is a lot of criticism from people with, I suppose, traditional mindsets in companies who say that using approaches like running lean or the lean startup, that all we're doing is releasing half-baked solutions to poorly identified problems to market. How do you respond to criticisms like that?
And so half-baked because they're maybe...
Yeah, half-baked as in they're not fully functional, the MVPs, they don't have all the bells and whistles.
Yeah. So I guess on that, I often use some counter examples. So I'll use some so oftentimes there's this kind of myth that the MVP has to be a cheap and fast product. And for me, it's not about being cheap and fast, but cheaper and faster than the alternative. Yeah. And so if we look at products like the iPhone, I would almost say the iPhone 1 was an MVP. It had lots of missing features. It was the butt of a lot of jokes. It didn't have basic copy and paste. You couldn't multitask between apps. They still were named Innovation of the Year because they were trying to solve one problem, which is take 3 devices, a music player, a phone, an internet device, put it into one. And I can see Steve Jobs running around like a maniac saying, as long as we can deliver on that, everything else is icing on the cake. Yeah. Right. So it's that focus that is what the MVP is about. So it's not about kind of building an incomplete or a half-finished product. Another big example kind of from recent would be Tesla. So when Tesla was building their first car, they realized that what they were really trying to solve was range anxiety. And the way you do it is not by building a car, but rather building a battery. So instead of the traditional route of going and hiring automotive engineers, factories, and all that stuff, and building a car, they just went and licensed a car from Lotus, took out its guts, put their battery in there, and sold that as an MVP. Yeah. So that was also a minimum viable product.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And we touched a little bit on metrics, and one thing that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with, and even in corporate environments, it is the question of how much data is enough. At what point do we say this experiment or this assumption is valid or invalid? Is there a risk that we're pulling the plug early or we're waiting too long? And how do you balance that?
Yeah, so so that's where I like the clarity of the 5 metrics in the R metrics kind of model. The world has changed. We've actually gone from a point where it was hard to measure stuff to where we're in the other extreme, where you can measure almost anything. And so as a result of that, I find we don't get more clarity. We actually just give ourselves permission to drown in in a sea of data and just get more lost. And so I look at there's a place for secondary metrics, and that's one of the key messages in the book, is that you do want to track a lot of things, but you don't have to really look at them. You want to first identify what are which is the key constraint or the key metric you want to move. And how do you kind of just visualize that one? So when you're designing an experiment, typically think about which one of those 5 metrics you want to change. Is it acquisition, activation, retention? And how does that connect up to the overall throughput of the business? Is that really working? And when the experiment doesn't give you the lift that you're looking for, that's where the secondary metrics come in. And so when you talk about how much data, it's going to be a function of just what happens with that experiment, how deep you have to dig in.
Yeah, makes sense. And you mentioned there, you focus on either acquisition or activation, where you are in the funnel. One of my previous guests was Ben Yoskowitz, who wrote Lean Analytics, so the one metric that matters. I imagine you're an advocate for that approach, focusing on your one key metric.
Yes, with a caveat. So one of the things that I found is that you can sometimes get lost just focusing on one metric. And so to give you an extreme example of this, if we go into what I call the curse of specialization, as a company grows, we go to our salespeople and say, your one metric that matters is closing sales. That's all I want you to do. And I'll even incentivize you. I'll give you commissions if you do that. Magically, sales close at the end of the month. And when you kind of study that behavior, you begin to see that the people who close at the end of the month maybe not as happy about the closing as the ones who close earlier in the month. And you can see that in the churn rate. So they actually cancel more often than people who close earlier because they were under time pressure. They were kind of forced into an aggressive sales environment. They said yes, but they didn't mean to say yes. So all those things begin to happen. So that's when I say, when you focus just on that one metric, you forget to see that, and that's where the systems thinking in the second book comes into play, is that you start to optimize for a local metric, a local KPI, but you fail to really affect the overall throughput of the system. Sure. So for me, it's great to have that clarity to say acquisition or activation is the thing that is currently the constraint. But when you design an experiment to fix that, you have to make sure that it has follow-on effects. You're not creating this illusion of increasing lift in one and then at the expense of something else. Yeah. Another extreme example of this, and this actually comes from Eric Ries's previous company, IMView. They actually did the same thing. As they scaled, they began to design the team structure into the 5 metrics, and they incentivize everyone. So the retention team got so good at retaining people that they actually forgot to buy the product. Right. It's like, we're having all this stuff for free. Why should we buy the product? So when you're doing things like that, then the one metric focus, maybe not the best thing.
Yeah, and I think, couldn't agree more. And when you look at that at a high level in many large companies, they're focused on their short-term metrics and satisfying shareholders and paying out dividends. But at the same time, that comes at the cost of innovation. And 5 years down the track, they're being disrupted by smaller upstarts. Makes perfect sense. And on large companies who may be a little bit wary of experimenting because it may cause, say, reputational damage to their brands, how should such companies approach experimentation? I mean, if I'm a large financial institution or a healthcare company and I've got multi-billion-dollar market cap and shareholders and multiple stakeholders, how do I manage that?
Yes, there are a number of tactics. One of the most commonly used one is really just simply going off brand. So you go off brand and you can preserve the brand. Even if you were staying on brand, you have to realize that not all customers are created equal. There are going to be segments of your customers that are not maybe even your tier 1 customers, but your tier 2 or tier 3 that are willing to get into a mode. They'll get on your advisory board. They'll be willing to take things that are somewhat experimental, somewhat early, because they want that competitive advantage of getting access to things that help them faster. So for me, it's fundamentally about creating a partnership with your customers. We always look at, I'm going to build this perfect product and then sell it to my customers. But if you actually go into this co-creation environment and you say, I'm here to help you, the customer, and let's work on kind of this collaboratively, it's amazing what you can do. So to me, that often is a concern that I see a lot of people raise. We cannot hurt brand, we cannot hurt revenue, we cannot hurt our reputation. But there are lots of tactical solutions to get around that.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think Intuit Labs are a great model of a company that does that. I think they have a partnership with a segment of their customers and they release beta products under the Intuit Labs brand, and therefore they're able to get feedback from actual customers. And it's different to focus groups, right? Because from what I understand, a lot of focus groups, people are, 1, paid to be there, 2, asked if they would use a product, but not really asked to pay for the product. What's your view on focus groups versus the type of customer testing that you advocate?
Yeah, so there's definitely that problem, which is, people are paid to be there. But the more important thing is that you kind of get into this groupthink mindset. So, we've got an audience here. If we start focus grouping things, there'll be a few vocal people that will start to steer the conversation. And pretty soon everyone seems to agree, but that's not necessarily what they may be thinking. So it's counterintuitive, but by almost doing the opposite, which is talking to every one of you individually, I can get to more insights about what will work and what will not work faster than doing it as a group. And it's a counterintuitive reality, as in Lean, there are many, many such counterintuitive realities, which is in some ways also the Achilles heel of the methodology. So many people don't think that should be what they should be doing.
I take it then you'd be a fan of the whole working alone together approach. For example, if you're in a workshop setting and rather than one person saying, I think this is a good idea, and everyone else kind of echoes his thoughts, if everyone silently writes their ideas down and then brings them together, you're going to get way more ideas.
I mean, there are lots of these techniques, and even from this. So in the next book, there's this concept of a lean sprint, and we use a lot of these techniques, and some of them are inspired from agile sprints, scrum sprints, design sprints, even that Google Ventures kind of put together. And one of the techniques there is the note and vote. So rather than asking, I have this problem, what are solutions, and have people just vocalize them, you have them write them down and then kind of shortlist them, put them on, put a timer and have them shout out the ideas, and you get a lot more independent thinking that way than doing group stuff. Even with the lean canvas exercise, I actually find it is faster to get a team to go and individually take a stab at the canvas and then go to a poster and put all their Post-it notes, and then you begin to see where the overlaps are, than having them do it as a team. It, again, seems like it would make more sense to brainstorm and create that together, but you get into so many debates that it takes 3 times as long.
And how important is it to defer judgment of the different ideas at that part of the process?
Oh, absolutely. So, and I think it was an Einstein quote, and again, it may be not misattributed to him, I don't know, but he talked about this idea of diversity of ideas being the most important thing. And I see that even in the world we live in. So I talk a lot about the innovator's bias for the solution. That manifests its ugly head in many ways. So in the beginning, we fall in love with the solution. But later on, when you are even a team that is specialized, if I present a problem to you, I say I've got a low activation rate problem, and you're a designer, you pretty much will come up with a UX solution. That's not what I've observed. Your developers will come up with building more things or making things faster, and your marketers will come up with some marketing solution. Yeah. So again, nothing wrong with that by itself, but the key is you want to get to a point where you present a problem, don't bias people with a solution, get a lot of independent thinking, and then you find fast and effective ways to test those ideas and double down on the ones that actually show you results.
Yeah. And you touched on a good point there with designers, developers, marketers. In some cases, perhaps all thinking that it's their work that's turning the dial on the metrics. And how important is it that those metrics are accessible and auditable, so you don't have marketing saying it was our marketing campaign, and Dev saying it was that feature we released.
Yeah, so I have a quote in the second book too. It's a rising tide raises all ships. And so what I mean by that is that when the numbers are good, everyone takes credit for it. Yeah. But a falling tide raises all fingers, right? So then it's no longer my problem, it's the other person's problem, because nothing's really changed. We're still doing the same thing we did last month. Yeah. And so I absolutely bringing in this perception of making the metrics be very visible, but as you said, auditable and trackable are just so critical. Yeah. And even just asking those fundamental first principle questions. If a designer came to me and said, I'm going to create a better design and aesthetically it looks better, you still have to test that it has that lift in the metric you're looking for. Mm-hmm. And we have actually done things where a design looks better visually, but it was the copy that was really converting. Mm-hmm. And so when you put the same design in there was no lift in conversion. So we just spent time to create a better looking version of the same thing, which you can say was fine because it didn't take us that long. But when you do things where you're putting kind of lipstick on something that's already working, it doesn't really help you all that much. Yeah.
Makes perfect sense. And a couple more questions I had just on regulated companies. A lot of listeners of this show are from incredibly regulated companies, health insurers, financial services, superannuation, what you guys call 401k. Yep. How can you effectively experiment when you've got the watchdogs looking down on you?
Yeah, so there are some great case studies. There's a company that was used to be called Kaching. Now they're Wealthfront. They work in the SEC regulated market. So they've got a story of how they continuously deploy code, and you have to just take more measures. But they got all of that kind of approved. So sometimes it's more work, but it's the thing to remember is that in a lean startup environment, speed is the advantage. Mm-hmm. And so if you can outlearn your competition, you win. And sometimes that requires you to do more work up front. But also at the same time, when we talk about medical devices and things, we don't want to be experimenting on patients. But what I find is that you have to go, if food is the same type of thing, you have to go through all the safety kind of standards. If you're building a car, same type of things. Mm-hmm. But we time and time again see that those are not the riskiest things in the business. Yeah. The riskiest things are really around the switching behavior. So people are currently driving a non-electric car. Will they switch to an electric car? Mm-hmm. What are the obstacles? Can you test for that? Similarly, on the medical devices side, I had this one story from a team that was building a dental compound that could help reduce cavities in babies. And they thought all along, once we build this stuff, we'll go to dentists and they will just sell this like hotcakes. Once the product was actually built, they approached a few dentists, and the dentist just said, why would I sell this? It reduces my billable work. If no cavities means people don't come to me. So thanks, but no thanks. That could have been tested day one. You didn't have to wait 4 years, which is what this team did. They were just perfecting and getting all the clinical trials and all of that stuff. And then when they went to roll it out, they realized that was not going to be a channel they could use. They had to probably go the retail route, which has lost them a lot of time. Yeah. So again, when you start with what's riskiest, it may not be the regulated industry. There are other risks, customer risk, market risk, adoption risk that you tackle before those things. Yeah,
and that comes back to the lean canvas, validating your problem, your solution, customer segments, and so on. And I think GE is a great case study of a company who's applied this approach. I think in their industrial division, they've applied it to traditional industrial circuit breakers, and I think half the cost or the time to market for circuit breakers, and they're using it on medical devices and everything else. So it can be done in regulated industries and big bureaucratic organizations.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And finally, I'm a massive advocate of flow and getting into flow. And I know in your book you talk about both getting into flow as a startup and getting into flow as an individual. So how do you get into flow, Ash?
Yeah, so I'll first talk about what triggered that. So again, there's always a trigger I find for these types of kind of behavior changes. So I was not one that was very efficient with my time before, but then I had kid number one and then I had kid number two, all while I was building a startup and kind of in the midst of it. And so I began to realize that I could negotiate with my spouse. You can always negotiate for more time, but you can't negotiate with a crying baby. So if it's your turn to take care of the baby, you've got to go do it. And so that forced me to kind of appreciate free time. And I began to view time as a scarcest resource. And so that's when I began to say, how can I get into flow? I can get in and out of it very quickly. And so there are a number of work hacks that I began to build. One of them was realizing that to be able to do maker time, to be able to do maker work, you need uninterrupted blocks of time. So when is the best time to do it? For some people, it's late at night. Other people, it's early in the morning. I realized that early in the morning was good because that was also when our kids were sleeping through and they were still kind of asleep then. So I would, even though I was not a morning person, would wake up and just have these blocks, 2-hour blocks, 3-hour blocks of uninterrupted time where I would write the book or write code or do things like that and not have any distractions. So I'll email everything off. Don't even look at it. So just wake up and just get to work and you just have that beginner's fresh mind and you can just quickly jump into, at least for me, get into flow. And so that was also my personality. I tend to be very accomplishment driven. If I have a day where I feel like I haven't pushed something forward, it's not a good day for me. I just don't feel like it was well done. So for me, doing that heavy lifting up front allows me to then spend the rest of the day for more managerial types of things. So that's when you're interrupt driven, when you have to go talk to customers or fight fires or talk to your team or tend to a crying baby, all of those types of things.
Yeah, and I guess there's lots of different hacks people can apply. I think Tim Ferriss is a massive advocate of checking his email, I believe, twice a day. Because once you check your email, you just start chasing little fairy rabbits down the rabbit hole. Right? So, okay, we are down to the lightning round. Are you ready, Ash?
Sure.
Fantastic. Okay, question number one. If you could work for any company at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
It would probably be for one of Elon Musk's companies, just because I want to understand just how good of a strategist he really is and how many hours he actually does work to do all the things he does.
Yeah, love it. Question number 2 out of 3 is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
I don't know. So I tend to be very kind of goal-driven. So, that's a tough one. I probably would say it would probably be Steve Jobs, and I would probably, ask him about, I guess just how he connected the dots between a lot of the products that he built. So there's all these conspiracy theories of, starting with, having the vision all thought out. Was it really, connecting all the dots up front, or was it really a discovery process? Because we always look at Apple as the anti-lean example, and I have a theory that a lot of it is still discovery on the fly. It's just they do things kind of in a different way and call it different things, but they still do a lot of customer learning, just not the same way that we advocate for.
Yeah, and I guess Steve Jobs famously said he connected the dots looking backwards, right? So the Stanford calligraphy class, his Zen Buddhism,
right?
Dropping in at Xerox's research center and stealing their GUI, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And the last question was around, how do you stay on top of your game, Ash? Do you have any rituals or routines?
So one of them I talked about. It's getting the most important thing done early in the day. The other thing is I'm a ardent unitasker. I don't believe in multitasking, and so even though on the outside it looks like I'm doing all kinds of things, I run workshops, I write books, we build software products. It's all a juggling illusion. So it seems like we're juggling 3 balls in the air, but there's only one ball really up in the air. The other 2 are just like a real juggler planted in your hand, and it's a very additive process. So I look at the workshops as feeding into the learning, which then goes into the writing, which may then go into the products. So everything kind of connects together well.
Yeah. And I guess there's a lesson there for companies who are just trying to do too many different things. It's hard enough to find product market fit for one idea, let alone 5 at the same time.
Right, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Ash. You've been an amazing guest. Of course, people can find out a little bit more about you at ashmaurya.com and as well on Twitter at ashmaurya, leanstack.com as well. Just Google him. You'll find a ton of resources. Well, thank you so much, Ash. You've been a great guest. Let's give it up. Well, that's it for my chat with Ash Maurya. It was a lot of fun to host him in front of a live audience here at Collective Campus for our first episode of Future² Live. We'll be running a lot more of these for those of you in Melbourne in the future, so keep your eyes peeled to your inboxes for that one. As always, if you are enjoying these podcasts, if you want to see and hear us bring you more guests, the caliber of Ash Maurya and others, such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Jake Knapp, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, and others that we've brought to you on this podcast over the last 6 months, it would make our lives a lot easier if you spent just a few seconds of your time to like, share, or subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. As always, if you'd like to find out a little bit more about Collective Campus, the innovation hub, school, and consultancy based in Melbourne's CBD, you can do so at collectivecamp.us. You'll also be able to access a ton of free goodies there, including other podcasts, blogs, infographics, innovation resources, videos, webinars, and access to live events here at our event space in Melbourne CBD. So with that, keep innovating. Future² out.